for a far too generous welcome. I've had a lovely day here today. I enjoyed talking to the students earlier at lunch, and I really feel welcome, so thank you so much. It's also a great privilege to be invited to talk about my research. So this is from a book project I'm working on, and I invite feedback, candid feedback at any time. Do not hesitate. Gunnar, I know you have a question. So let's begin. And the last known quagga, an old mare, died very far from the African veldt. She died in the Amsterdam Zoo in the hot summer of 1883. Unlike this isolated quagga in her European cage, her fellow quaggas named onomatopoeically for their barking call, quagga. They had historically roamed the southern tip of Africa at the Cape, and their herds were huge, often several thousand strong. The animals seemed in endless supply. Victorian sport hunters, for example, referred to the country being checkered black and white with their congregated masses, and their thudding hooves were like the tremendous charge of cavalry. But as the 19th century wore on, quaggas were increasingly hunted for hides and sometimes for their meat, although usually they were taboo to most groups because they were a little bit too much like horses. So they were really targets in a burgeoning gun culture that saw them as potentially competition for livestock grazing. So as the Trekboers, as the early Dutch settlers, to become Afrikaners later, moved north, they feared the competition these massive herds of animals presented for their own domestic stock. Hunters kind of got a vague sense that the population was thinning, but their seemingly vast numbers, further entrenched in the imagination by their preference for living in these vast herds, made it difficult to conceive that they could be exterminated. And then to exacerbate it, to make it worse, their migratory ways made it even harder to realize that they were really dying out and that they were not just temporarily roaming elsewhere on the ancient seasonal routes. So, when the last known quagga died, no one realized it meant extinction, the loss forever of a creature once ubiquitous. But the quagga is back from the dead, and his name is Kevin. Let me show you Kevin. So, the quagga is back. His name's Kevin. Kevin, his Facebook profile tells us, works as an assistant lecturer in equine studies at Elsenburg College, which is an agricultural college in my university town, affiliated to my university, set among the vineyards of Stellenbosch near Cape Town. Now, he was rejected about 6 years ago by his biological mother, and his new human foster mother is a lecturer at the agricultural college. And I interviewed her, and she said she simply received a message on her answering machine asking if she could take in a quagga. She remembers ignoring the message at first. She said, "Shit, Sandra, I thought it was a student prank. Even I know the quagga is extinct." So Kevin, this creature, was brought to the agricultural college, fed electrolytes and glucose with a syringe, and he has become a beloved student mascot. His Facebook page offers updates on his life at the college. However, his relationship to other zebras is complicated. His Facebook status, and in fact his ontological status, is hotly debated. So what is a quagga? All right, well, a quagga might be described as a zebra facing austerity measures. Nature has been parsimonious with the stripes. In fact, one of my students from Zimbabwe said, "It looks like a zebra who forgot to put on his pajama pants." The few extant paintings and the very few photographs show us a creature that looks very eerily familiar to a zebra, but different. It's an animal striped or striated on its forequarters, transitioning to a light brown along its rear and underbelly with long white socks. But in other ways, the quagga and the ordinary plain zebra seem very similar. In fact, it was suggested by a German zookeeper, Lutz Heck, in his 1955 book, Grosswald im Etoshaland, that an ordinary plain zebra, a regular zebra or zebra, carefully chosen for diminished stripes and a more brownish coat, could be bred over time to similar creatures and over generations produce an animal at least visually identical to the extinct quagga. Well, this notion was embraced by a German-born taxidermist guy who stuffs animals for museums or what have you, a man called Reinhold Rau, who was based at the South African Museum in Cape Town. A very interesting man. In 1969, this man, Reinhold Rau, this guy, Reinhold Rau, attempted to restore the museum's pitiful, sawdust-stuffed, sagging quagga foal, a mere week old at death, big-eyed, wobbly-kneed, awkwardly vulnerable. And on his own dime, he paid for this himself in 1971 on a taxidermist, a low-level administrator at the time at the museum. Rau gathered money himself and paid for his own tour to see all the existing quagga skins, and there were not many, in European museums. Because he wanted to do it right. He wanted to restuff it in a way that made it look realistic. And this really was like a sort of an amateurish attempt at a stuffed toy, and he wished it to look authentic. But what struck him as he looked at all these extant quagga skins, things that had been called quagga, was how very varied they were. It suddenly seemed to him that there wasn't a deep and clear distinction between zebras and quaggas. Instead, it seemed like there was a variety of ways to be this creature, that there was a gamut, a continuum, if you will, of faded stripes, long white socks. Nothing looked entirely the same. Everything was a little bit distinct. And that made him believe that despite the quagga's distinct Linnaean classification, Equus quagga quagga, it was simply perhaps the southern version of the plain zebra, Equus burchellii. So in other words, the same beast genetically. But locally, when this idea was first mooted, state conservation personnel hated the idea. I've looked at the papers, I have had access to the quagga archives, and they say things like it's merely an academic exercise. Why would you want to make a facsimile? It's just a look-alike, whatever your plan is. Really, the idea was that this was a doomed and idiotic way to spend time. Southern Africans, and more broadly speaking, the Anglophone scientific world, said that the quagga was a discrete and distinct separate species, which doomed, in their mind, Reinhold Rau's plan to mere whimsy, really a doomed notion. However, two things happened in the early 1980s. One was a paradigmatic shift in the history of big science, and the other was a small, coincidental, and idiosyncratic choice. But both, of course, are grist to our historiographic mill. So the first was a dramatic advance in techniques to do with molecular biology. In 1984, Russell Higuchi and colleagues at the University of California used sequenced DNA from this very quagga foal that Rau had supplied, and they used the tissue from this little foal. Interesting, and they were able to make all sorts of deductions, but this was a brand new advance in science. And interestingly, literary legend declares that Michael Crichton, author of course, Jurassic Park. Has anyone read or seen the movie, maybe the Spielberg movie? All right, that's going to be important. Legend says that this is actually where Michael Crichton got the idea. And spoiler alert, Michael Crichton does come to see the quagga later. So it's all connected. Higuchi later thanked Reinhold Rau for the inspiration in a letter which I located in the archive, which said, without Rau's interest, it could never have taken place. And this was a pretty significant advance in molecular biology. Further molecular study using the same DNA, mitochondrial DNA extracted from the quagga, suggested that Reinhold Rau's hunch and Lutz Heck's hunch that the quagga was really simply a kind of ordinary plain zebra was right. So that was the DNA analysis, the big science side of the story. But the second development is more indicative of the intimate personal networks buttressing these big intellectual developments in the history of science. Very simple thing happened, just a coincidence. A retired vet, a veterinary surgeon, retired from Southwest Africa, now Namibia, a guy called J.F. Warning. He simply happened to retire to the town which is adjacent to Stellenbosch, Somerset West. And he had been a livestock breeder in Namibia or Southwest Africa, and he had once, coincidentally, hosted the German zookeeper, Lutz Heck, at his farm on a hunting trip. So this, of course, had resulted, this hunting trip in Etoshaland, had resulted in Lutz Heck's book, which had helped trigger Rao's initial interest. And so all these things were connected, and it snowballed. And this guy, Warning, prodded Rao into actually taking action. He prodded Rao into setting up a very small committee, not government-funded, all private, in 1986. So there was no government funding. It's just a kind of museum officials and some farmers and some local capitalists. And the idea was just to see what they could do with this backbreeding idea. So they created a little herd of 9 zebras that were donated from all over South Africa. People would write random letters. Can we have a zebra? And could it have not all that many stripes? If you have one with fewer stripes, that's the one we want. And sometimes they would just say no, and are you crazy? But at other times they would say, well, okay, we don't particularly want the one with few stripes. We'll ship that right down to you. And so he started off on a little farm outside Robertson in the winelands, and the first foal was born the following year. For almost 2 decades, Rao tended his herd of beloved monsters. Let me show you Rao. So for almost 20 years, he tended his herd of monsters, his quaches, his becoming quaches, his quaches, his embryonic quaches, however you want to perceive them. He died in 2006, but the project continues. Traditional selection for particular traits, for particular characteristics, was and still is rigorously applied. The quacha-like are mated with the quacha-like, and the failed facsimiles are flogged for funding. New mutations, of course, can occur, but deviants that don't comply with what they're looking for are culled from the herd. And after 4 generations, the new creatures began to show a visible degree of stripe reduction. They began to resemble the creatures that Rao had seen on his 1971 tour of quachaskins in Europe. So, success, question mark. The quacha is de-extincted, it's back. So the story I've told you there is really kind of a capsule history of the quacha project, told with a gentle triumphalism, a sense of Whiggish success in the project. But that really is only where our questions as historians begin. See what these things look like. Success, question mark. If one returns to the origin story, which is our job as historians, one learns that the local de-extinction, and by de-extinction I mean bringing back from the dead, reviving the creature, restoring it. The local de-extinction idea was suggested to Rao by reading Lutz Heck, the German zookeeper's book. But there was an older motive. As a young man, Rao had witnessed Lutz raise the dead. Lutz, and here it begins, Lutz and his brother Heinz had run the Berlin and Munich zoos respectively in the run-up to World War II. Both were well connected to the National Socialist elite, and in line with Nazi eco-mythology, they celebrated autochthonous Aryan animals. For the 1936 Olympics, for example, Lutz Heck created a Teutonic zoo with Wolf Rock at its hub, surrounded by quintessentially German animals like bears and lynxes. But the Heck brothers also wanted to resurrect the long-dead and half-mythic beasts found in the romantic opera of Wagner. In fact, the Heck brothers wanted to bring back the ancient creatures of the conifers. So just as the quacha project was to do 40 years later, Lutz Heck simply adopted a traditional method of breeding selected animals to accentuate certain characteristics, Now, this is not highfalutin cloning of animals a la Jurassic Park. This is the basic premise of domestication. If you, for example, Kevin, wish to create a really terrifying domesticated cat, and you were quite drawn to the idea of a saber-toothed cat that was your pet, you could breed it with Gunner's cat, who had a nasty streak of temper, and perhaps, no, just kidding, and then pick the most vicious of that litter and start the project and backbreed, always picking the most nasty-tempered cat you could find. You can make yourself a saber-tooth, well, it's certainly an extremely livid domestic cat in a number of generations. I'm not sure what you would then do with it. But, you know, that's up to you. The possibilities are endless. But what I'm saying is this, and this is not high science. This is not cloning. This is not getting the mosquito in Jurassic Park and extracting the DNA. This is the fundamental premise of domestication. We've been doing this since the Neolithic Revolution 10,000 years ago. And this is what the Heck brothers were going to do. And why were they going to do it? Well, the idea was remembering that even in apparently vanished animals, genes, to put it crudely, stay in the gene pool of its direct descendants. So they want to backbreed to their extinct ancestors. And to do so, why did they want to do that? Well, they wanted to revive totemic animals. They were particularly interested in reviving the aurochs. You will have seen that in cave paintings, the progenitor of our modern-day bulls and cows. So a magnificent and terrifying animal. In fact, a bovine so scary that even Julius Caesar noted in his conquest of the area that he was scared of it. And it took rather a lot to scare Julius Caesar. The other thing they wanted to bring back was the bison, the forest-dwelling bison, and the tarapan, which was a forest wild horse. And the idea was to bring back these creatures. Why'd they want to do it? Well, it was wrapped up with the ideology of the Nazis. They wanted to bring back primordial purity. They wanted to purge the degeneration of domestication, as they saw it. The Heck brothers were under the direct patronage of Hermann Goering. Here he is, ironically, on the far right. But together, they wanted to rewild the forests of the Third Reich with living totems to its power. And they just happened to acquire some forest land in Poland, and so the plan was to release the animals there. Now, these romantic restoration programs corresponded very closely with Nazi theories of racialized human hierarchy. The Heck brothers were close friends with Eugen Fischer and Konrad Lorenz. Now, we all love Konrad Lorenz. You know, he's avuncular, he imprints with little baby geese. We love him. And he won the Nobel Prize for ethology for animal behavior. He's also the Nazi you can take home to mother. Because despite this avuncular appearance, very, very closely connected, he was able to get photographs and things like that from the Heck brothers zoos. Quite a tight-knit group of people subscribing to this Nazi ideology. Lorenz, for example, argued that domesticated beast and urbanized human, which obviously was his way of referring in a coded fashion to Jews, both suffered degeneration of muscles and morals. The wolf versus the dog, the Aryan versus the urban human. And he depicted these things. So, this is not neutral. In trying to bring back this primordial purity to purge the, degeneration of domestication, the Heck brothers actually bred a paradox because they had to do this thing fast. They had to do it in time with the program, with Hitler's program, with Goering's program. So instead of backbreeding in the traditional fashion, selecting two cows, picking the two that most resembled the aurochs, breeding them over time, the way the Quagga project was to do 40 years later, instead, they had to do it fast. They got different species from Spain, from other parts of Europe, and just bred them together to create, ironically, a hybrid mongrel of modern breeds. So it was almost the inverse of what they were claiming to create. In any case, most of these ancient creatures came back only very briefly. The aurochs in the Polish forest were shot by hungry soldiers for food as the war went on. And when the Allies bombed Berlin in January 1944, the zoo animals largely burned in their cages. Some escaped, and Lutz Heck's son had to shoot their aurochs. But some animals did survive from this project at the Munich Zoo. And indeed, it was this creature that Reinhold Rau had seen as a young man, which had inspired him later, at least partly, in the quagga breeding project. Years before he emigrated to South Africa from Germany, Reinhold Rau had encountered Heck's, by then elderly aurochs, performing in a traveling circus. Quite a come down for the animal that had once terrified Julius Caesar. But okay, the Heck's brothers' vision was essentially of expansion, territorially, but also temporarily. So across the borders into Poland and back in time to revive extinct beasts. So in a sense, it was a bloody remaking of history, a savage remaking of history, landscape and the body, which of course echoes the Nazi project itself. And the ideological baggage that has persisted over time has created a kind of easy, glib slippage into kind of conflating the creator's sin with the animal's original sin. I would call this the sin of Frankenstein or the sin of Prometheus. In the Frankenstein myth, the monster is blamed, not the creators of the monster. And something quite similar has happened here. Let me explain what I mean. This ideological baggage has carried on as late as 2009. Now, a couple of these aurochs did survive, the ones that came from the Munich Zoo. And over time, of course, they're no longer called the aurochs. Sometimes they're called Heck cattle. But they're oddly popular because they're a tourist attraction. They do, draw interest and the punters. And also they're quite good at maintaining certain environments with their grazing habits. So in 2009, a couple of Heck cattle were imported into Devon, into the United Kingdom. And when this leaked out, the British press responded, well, in the calm, measured way we've come to expect from the British press. It doesn't end. We were only following others. Giant Nazi cows on the loose in Britain. Nazi super cows. Oh, we'll come back to that later. Oh, well, there's more. So, okay, thereafter there followed a series of kind of de-extinction projects, restoration projects, Lazarus animal projects. The dodo was mooted as a possible subject, the passenger pigeon, the thylacine, but all of these were well-publicized failures because their attempt was to use science that we don't quite have yet, or impossible case studies. For example, bringing back the thylacine. Well, the last ancestor diverged from the thylacine 40 million years ago. So even were you able to clone the DNA available, somehow cause a fertilized egg to be ready, where would you put it? You don't have a womb with a view in which to put it. There would be no place to gestate it. So it was all doomed hype and PR to raise money for a museum in Sydney. So these were well-publicized failures. So far, the only thing successfully brought back from the dead in this way is 19th century arrogance. But this has not been the case in the quagga project. It has actually developed ideologically in the last 30 years. It's now really called the Rau quagga, not the quagga, which is a shift in naming, a shift in nomenclature towards a kind of humility. It inscribes the creature's own history and acknowledges that they've really only created a visible quagga phenotype. They've created a thing that looks like a quagga, and by saying Rau quagga, that acknowledges it in quite a humble, non-arrogant fashion, I think. I think this also reinforces the argument that a species is not so much a genetic event, it's also a human decision. The identity is biological, of course, but at least in part, it's historical. The second difference between these two projects, despite their links, is that while the HEC project was supported by a technocratic Nazi state for political ends, this has not been the case with the Quagga project at all. It was funded by local capitalists, by donations, with the idea perhaps of creating a middle-class tourist attraction. I think that was in the back of their mind, that this idea of uniting private philanthropy, business interests, white landed notables usually in South Africa, to create an attraction that people would come and see, a tourist attraction. And this reflects a global trend in de-extinction efforts. There's an alliance between scientists and wealthy capitalists. And of course, in this manner, life imitates art, because that's exactly the premise of the film Jurassic Park. Remember? Yep. And this works because DNA is a durable, neatly packageable, replicatable. In some ways, it's a perfect commodity. So perhaps in some ways, these de-extinction projects are part of a scramble for a new market. Restoration for profit could be a form of neoliberal necromancy. And I think it's important to think about authenticity in all this, because once a cultural commodity has been stamped authentic, its market value rises, as does the demand for it. So maybe if you want to, there's certainly an argument to be made that the Quagga project was in part driven by profit. And certainly there are others who say it's an exercise in nostalgia, kind of sentimental Orientalism. It's very easy to dismiss it as quixotic, as idealistic, as romantic. But there's an undeniable elegance in its pre-20th century simplicity. This is not the bombastic Nazi power project, but rather the 19th century kind of gentlemanly pursuit of good breeding. And I think that there's some beauty in the smallness of the project's claims, but the largeness of its hope. So, let's see if we can draw some lessons as historians from the Quagga project and its history. And obviously, I totally agree with all of you who look grumpy that we historians don't sort of crassly draw these lessons, That's for airport historians who write about, the leadership lessons of Genghis Khan or dating advice from Henry VIII. But let's see if we can just draw some historiographic lessons from this. So, I do think that we can use this as, if not a way of understanding a slightly more animal-sensitive history, certainly a way of understanding our own human history a little better. And the first thing that strikes me is how very visual this has been in orientation. The quagga is named for its onomatopoeic bark. This has not been part of the equation. It's simply the visual. And that's something upon which we need to ponder, the importance of that in our own, as humans. That's how we interact first, primarily, it seems, with this project. But is that really how we interact with the world? And is that what defines an animal? The second thing is slightly more complicated. Animals are classified, I would also perhaps say, culturally constructed in ways that depend very heavily on who's doing the classifying. And thirdly, the Quagga project extends the idea that the way humans relate to animals offers a window in how they relate to other humans. Work with me. What I'm saying is usually in most forms of power relations in history, there's a pattern we can see. Usually, the dominant, the hegemonic, are linked to culture, and the subordinate group is linked to nature. This has been the case. Gender theorists could say that women have been linked more closely to nature, but you can see it in all sorts of situations. Just to take quite a removed example from the South African experience, the wild Irish were said by the English to be much closer to nature, much more primitive in their state. And when the first gorilla appeared in the London Zoo, and Darwin's theory was in the air, people said, yeah, I can see it. You can see that the Irish are the missing link. So remember, in all sorts of ways, people have been othered by the dominant group by being told that, you're closer to nature. But this is kind of turned on its head with projects like the Quagga Project and, in fact, the cult of conservation. It opens up for us as historians a kind of new way of looking at this, what I really would call the middle-class cult of conservation. And perhaps in the South African context, it gets a much more specific identity, perhaps, a white identity even, claiming some groups, not to overgeneralize, ownership of the land through the fact that it is protected by that group. So there's a way of claiming a different kind of autochthony, of belonging, by claiming guardianship of nature. And does this Western cult of nature conservation maybe perhaps offer us a new folk taxonomy with the Lazarus creature, the Rao Quagga, a totemic species for the leisured middle classes? Because I think we can't ignore the close kinship ties between the Quagga and another wild beast, capitalism itself. So, I think to conclude, all animals are real, but some animals are more real than others. Restoring or recreating or creating a facsimile, however you individually wish to perceive what has happened here, such restoration projects are entrenched in their own historical contexts, both in terms of the science that renders them possible, but the zeitgeist that renders them desirable. It's really not very often that a historian, can touch the face of the past, let alone scratch it on its velvety muzzle, as I did. But accepting that, as a historian, that species determination is at least in part a historical and human decision, I went to the archives with these questions. But, as a social historian, I wanted to understand this kind of history, the history of this project and the history of other restoration projects. In the ethnographic grain, I wanted to ask people what they thought about it. So the same questions that I posed to the archives, going through the Rao papers, reading 1 million scientific articles, reading what the other conservation officials had said about it, reading Russell Higuchi's papers, trying to piece all that together, I went with those questions to the archives. But I also wanted to ask human beings how they experienced the same questions. So I went to the foster mother of that orphaned Quagga at Elsenburg Agricultural College, and I posed the exact same questions that I'd asked the archives. I posed them to her. I said, what makes an animal itself? Can a single Quagga exist without being inducted into his culture by the herd? Can he be authentically Quagga if brought up only with humans and horses? Does he even look like a Quagga because he was castrated, he was gelded? He lives on a completely different diet. He eats alfalfa, he gets, supplements. Does he sound like a Quagga? Does he bark like a Quagga? Does he smell like a Quagga? What gives him his Quagga-ness? What gives him his identity? Is it genetics, behavior, or history? And there was a very long silence before she answered, is he a real Quagga? I don't know. We just think of him as Kevin. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.